about 70 people sign up. And I guess I will
Yeah, I
just.
think good to go.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, we'll begin now. And I'm Terry Cortvriend, the representative for the southern part of Portsmouth and the east side of Middletown. And my colleague Lauren Carson and I have been, we started this Aquidneck Island Climate Caucus just as a way to bring what we were learning up in Providence and at the State House back here to the island, and to try to raise your voices that we could take back with you. And then we have found that people have found this very educational. And so we have enjoyed it, and we're glad so many people are interested. And so this evening, the discussion is retreat or rise buildings. And we have 3 speakers that have experience in both of these initiatives. We have Mark Thompson, Bob Rulli, and Neal Hingorany, and they both bring a level of expertise. We're going to start with Mark Thompson from the Newport Restoration Foundation, and we're going to kind of go from historic buildings to what's happening now to what may be happening in the future with Bob Rulli, the town planner from Warren, and Neal is an engineer from Narragansett Engineering. And so we look forward to the discussion. And Lauren,
Yeah, I just wanted to say welcome to everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces here. As Terry said, we've been doing this for about 2 years, and we've done some in person and some in Zoom. We'll take about an hour, a little bit more than an hour. And we think that maybe one of the reasons that this was so popular was because of the traumatic experience we all had with Ida a month ago, and how it really became clear to so many people that water and drainage and sea rise is really here now. So we were planning this anyway, and it just happened that, it became very evident that it was a very timely discussion. So we think that these 3 gentlemen can address some issues and really share with us all thinking about how we can handle sea rise on Aquidneck Island, where most of us are from. We know we have some folks from off the island, but just some thinking about it. And we're thrilled to see you all here. So I guess with that, we'll just turn it over to Mark from the Newport Restoration Foundation. And he can tell us what kinds of steps historic people are, historic professionals are taking to really understand and get prepared for the preservation of historic buildings. Mark?
Thank you very much, Lauren, and Terry as well. I've attended many of these Climate Caucus meetings and really enjoyed them and learned a lot. Mike, if you want to, you can go ahead and put up my PowerPoint. Great. You want to go back to the beginning though? Sorry, we
Scrolled through, yeah.
We scrolled through a little bit. Yeah, there we go. So as Lauren said, I'm the executive director of the Newport Restoration Foundation, and I guess our situation with regard to the climate crisis is a little bit unique in that we're a nonprofit. You can go to the next slide, Mike. Just thought I'd let you know a little bit about NRF real quickly. As I said, we're a nonprofit. We were founded in 1968 by Doris Duke. We own 73 18th and 19th century homes on Aquidneck Island. Most of those are 18th century homes. Most of them are in Newport. We are the 4th or 5th largest taxpayer in the city of Newport. We're still at the point where, with regard to our houses, we're still searching for answers. We have more questions than we do answers at this point, but we are working toward getting some answers, and I'll talk about that. In addition to our homes, we also operate the Rough Point Museum at Doris Duke's home, the Whitehorn House Museum, which is a museum down on Thames Street, a museum of Newport furniture, craft, and design. We own Prescott Farm, which is out at the boundary line between Middletown and Portsmouth. We're advocates for historic preservation in and around Newport, and we have this initiative called Keeping History Above Water, that has its own web address, historyabove.water.org. Michael, you can go to the next one. So Keeping History Above Water is in part an outreach effort to talk about sea level rise and the climate crisis, and find out what's going on around the country with regard to historic properties. The first conference was in Newport in 2016. I'm sure that some of you attended that conference. Keeping History Above Water started before my arrival at Newport Restoration Foundation. I've been here about 3.5 years. And we've continued to have these conferences in Annapolis, St. Augustine, Nantucket. We were fortunate to be able to have a live conference in Charleston. It was sort of before the Delta variant reared its ugly head. We were able to do a live conference in Charleston, which is the photo to the right. We've also done some workshops in Palo Alto and Salem, just a few weeks ago. And the idea behind the conference is, again, it's a catalytic model. The idea is it will go to other jurisdictions, find out what they're doing, see what we can learn from those jurisdictions, keep this conversation going. We're trying to foster conversation. Some of the jurisdictions have come back to us and said, hey, we want to do another conference in the future. And we've said, well, we've gotten the conversation started. You can continue it on your own. And Nantucket, I know, has had a couple of conferences since, and Salem is planning something for next year. Next slide. So, but Keeping History Above Water is more than just conferences. We've also done some studies. Our first study was done in 2016. It was called Keeping 74 Bridge Street Above Water, but it was really about more than 74 Bridge Street. It was just about adapting houses. The study was performed by Union Studio and Building Conservation Associates. And in the study, they looked at various adaptation techniques, various things that could be done, mostly to the house itself, but also in the neighborhood. There was a discussion of capturing stormwater and our need to do that, something we need to do much better in that area. Elevating critical systems, things like boilers and hot water heaters, getting those out of the basement. Other things they talked about was raising the basement, installing flood vents in houses, and turning the basement into a cistern. And this is a publication that it should be on the History Above Water website, but if it's not, I'll make sure it gets up there. Next. And one of the things I would say that we learned from the first study, and I think it's an important point to make tonight, is that there's no one size fits all approach to any of this. I think sometimes we think with regard to houses, well, everybody ought to elevate their house or everybody ought to do this. And I really just don't think that's where we're headed. I think that some houses probably will need to be elevated, but perhaps not everyone will need to do that. Clearly, if you're in the Hill neighborhood as opposed to in the Point neighborhood, different things are going to be necessary. Some houses are more vulnerable than others, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. The other thing about adaptation is that I think we get into this notion of what they call the bathtub model of sea level rise, you know, that the water is going to rise uniformly in a neighborhood, and that everybody's going to see one feet. Everybody's going to, and that's just not the way. Water goes where there's space for it to go. And so all of us really are going to have different experiences with regard to sea level rise. So with the change in leadership at NRF in late 2016, we didn't do any studies for a couple of years, but in 2019, we did a study, resilience planning for 74 Bridge Street, which was again about more than 74 Bridge Street. It was about the neighborhood somewhat too. That's one of our houses in the neighborhood to the right. That study was conducted by Linean Solutions and the Built Environment Coalition. And again, that looked at various adaptation techniques, wet flood proofing, dry flood proofing, house elevation, house and lot elevation, perimeter barriers, moving houses. Should NRF be selling some houses? And we tried to put some hard numbers with some of these methods. What would it cost to do these things, and what would their engineering life be? So that was really the point of the 2019 study. Next slide. Between the second study and the third study, I wanted to mention a few things that happened. One, there was an interesting article in the New York Times called "We Cannot Save Everything." Historic neighborhood confronts rising seas. If you haven't seen that article, I recommend it. It's still available online. It's from July 2019, again, New York Times. And I think the thing that's interesting about it is that the reporter who, Cornelia Dean, who I think is with us here tonight, did such a good job of reaching out to different experts. The interesting thing is that just about everybody had different things to say about what we ought to be doing. Maybe we're going to need to retreat. Maybe we need to elevate. I think I said in the article that I think we needed to stay put for now. So it just goes to show that if there was one path here, if there was an easy solution, well, at least 2 years ago, we sure didn't know what that was. In November 2019, the National Park Service published guidelines for flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic properties. And again, they looked at different modalities for adapting properties, some that we looked at and some that we didn't. And then in January 2020, the Historic District Commission here in Newport promulgated their policy statement and design guidelines for elevating historic buildings. And all of these resources are available online. And the house on the right is 74 Bridge Street, which actually we did sell. We didn't sell because of sea level rise. We sold because we'd only owned the house for about a half dozen years and we'd never rehabilitated it. And in our list of priorities, we thought that spending the money to bring it up to the level of our other houses in terms of the finishes inside, that it wasn't a priority. So we sold it, but we sold it with easements so that the historic fabric would be protected inside and out. But we also sold it with a provision in the easement document that said that it could be elevated if the owners followed the National Park Service and HDC guidelines. And as you can see, it is being elevated as we speak. It's further along than this picture. Next slide, please. And currently we are doing our third study, which is NRF Properties Vulnerability Studies, which is in progress. Again, this is being done by Linean Solutions and Built Environment Coalitions. Preliminary findings are that we have 22 properties at risk for first floor flooding, breaching of the first floor in the event of a 100-year storm. Not all of those properties are in the point. One of them is in the 400 block of Thames Street. So it's not only the point that's threatened here. And I want to point out that this term 100-year storm is bandied about a lot. It's sort of falling out of favor a little bit, but what it really means is that there's a 1% probability. It's a storm with a 1% probability of occurring each year. Next slide, please. We also did a tenant survey. We asked a number of questions. I'm just going to talk about two quickly. The first is, in the past year, have you witnessed flooding in your neighborhood? 41% said yes, but keep in mind that this is all of our tenants, and a lot of our tenants are up on the hill. I think it would be fair to say that probably close to 100% of our tenants in areas like the Point neighborhood experienced flooding in the past year. Next. We also asked them, if you've witnessed flooding, how's it impacted your home? And this chart didn't exactly print like I wanted, but the important thing is that 46% of our tenants that saw flooding in their neighborhood saw water infiltration in the basement, and more than 10% were in a situation where there was an inability to walk or drive to or from somewhere as a result of that. So clearly flooding is becoming an increasing problem in Newport. Next, and I think next to last is, so what are our next steps? We're going to complete that vulnerability study, and we hope to share it with the community once it's done. In May of next year, we hope that some of you will join us. We'll be keeping history above water. Norfolk, certainly an area that has a lot to teach us and some serious problems in this area. And you can follow the conference updates at historyabovewater.org. And once our vulnerability study is done, we're going to start raising funds to begin adapting our houses. And I think certainly our focus is going to be on those 22 houses that are the most vulnerable. And I think our first step is elevating some of these critical systems that we have, and some of these boilers and the like. I don't think we're at the point yet where we're ready to say retreat's our only option. So at least for the near future, we're looking at adapting. And that's all I have. Next slide. Thanks very much. And I can be reached at mthompson@newportrestoration.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
I did put your website in the chat for people.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Sure, you're welcome. And with that, we can, I'd like to introduce Neal Hingorany. Forgive me if I'm botching your last name too, Neal.
No worries. Neal Hingorany. Hi, everyone. Could you allow me to share my screen if you don't mind?
Yep, Neal, you're the host now. So
Perfect. All right, great. So again, I am Neal Hingorany, the principal of Narragansett Engineering. We're an engineering firm located in Portsmouth. We've been on the island since 1985. Engineers, surveyors, environmental scientists. We do a lot, but a lot of what we do is consulting on coastal development projects. Just briefly, economics degree from UMass and a master's degree in environmental science from URI. Did a lot of my master's research on flood insurance and sea level rise, and I'm on a few sort of relevant volunteer committees. I'll talk about that in a moment. Just a really quick backtrack, just a kind of statement of the problem here is people like to live near the coast, all of us included. We've seen almost about a foot of sea level rise at present, sort of the chart here in the bottom right-hand corner. Hopefully everyone's seen that. And sea level rise conditions are expected to be on the order of 3 to 5 feet by 2100. There's a lot of different model variation, but that's the baseline. From a regulatory perspective, we have FEMA regulations that dictate the insurance costs for up to $250,000 worth of coverage. These are mandatory for all structures with mortgages. FEMA regulations dictate the base flood elevation, the new construction foundation type, whether a building has to be on piers or have flood vents, things like that. And we have local codes that dictate building heights. New England's obviously prone to infrequent, albeit major hurricanes. We've had the 38 hurricane. That's a sort of prototypical 100-year storm for the area. 1635 Great Colonial Hurricane. Great Storm of 1815. And see on the right-hand side here, you'll see the water levels reached in Providence for each of those, well, the 1815 and the 38 hurricane. The problem here, there's a long, I admit somebody here, there's a long interval between storms, often results in sort of a faded memory and potential policy non-compliance. It's not Florida. This doesn't happen on a yearly or decades basis. So it's sort of easy to forget. The next issue we have here is increased sea surface temperatures, obviously are projected to cause an increase in hurricane intensity. Top right, we've got something called a power dissipation index anomaly, which is really just a measure of the strength of the hurricane energy in a particular year. Sort of takeaway from this is that you can see the orange, the slope of the line is increasing. That's mostly due to the warming water temps. The bottom slide here again is an expected increase in wind speed per century. And the key here is, if you can see it, there's a very dark red splotch right below New England. It's sort of eroding our cold water buffer from hurricanes. Just a brief excerpt, it's likely that U.S. East Coast will experience unprecedented hurricane intensification in the future, causing even greater threats to the coastal community. So probably not much of a surprise. Here we have a FEMA flood insurance rate map. These maps are really backward looking. They're based on past storm data and current sea level data. They do show the expected inundation from a 100-year storm. They do not take into account sea level rise. They do not take into account increased rainfall or increased storm intensity. But this is the regulatory baseline right now. So it lags significantly behind the science, but this is the bar for code in terms of new or rehabilitated storms. And I think a good metric for these in a lot of the major Sandy, Katrina-like storms, more than 50% of damage claims are in non-flood map rated areas. And this is the Wellington Ave, Spencer Park area. I'll touch on this in a moment. And again, from a regulatory perspective, we have FEMA. They're rolling out something called Risk 2.0, which is basically just a change to the baseline rating system, just more advanced casualty modeling. Includes building construction type, not just elevation in the model there. But the problem is that flood insurance program is $20 billion in debt. It's about $1.4 billion each year. It still uses, like I said, the outdated maps. It still caps the rate increases at 18% per year. And it still allows for a pre-firm subsidy, AKA grandfathering of the rates. So it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't really fix the core of the problem yet. The key really here is that flood insurance is sort of heavily subsidized. So if you think of, all the bad drivers in the country, if we gave them cut rate insurance every time they got into an accident, we'd probably have more bad drivers and more accidents. The cross section here, really just a cross section of what the flood zones look like. These zones are velocity zones, moving on to A zones, which are still water zones. But the question is how we mitigate risk to structures. Well, fairly simple. We can build appropriate foundations, and we can build new, or we can raise houses. So again, this is relatively simple in theory, but it's incredibly expensive in practice, especially with the current environment. There are some exemptions for historic flood proofing, which I think Mark spoke on previously. Another takeaway is that sort of these greenhouses are non-elevated structures. So we would say pre-firm structures. And that regulation came about in 1968. So the vast majority of houses in Newport and Aquidneck Island are the greenhouses, not the yellow houses right now. And sort of the next slide here is, how we mitigate land risk. So it's not just risk to structures, it's risk to infrastructure, roads, utilities. One of the things we've done in the past is build seawalls or armoring, reinforcement. Armoring unfortunately results in a loss of coastal access. It can actually increase erosion to abutting properties or at the toe of the structure. Armoring does not prevent water table increases. So when the tide rises, that actually raises the base water table. That can cause basement flooding, drainage, infrastructure, and septic issues. Armoring has environmental detriments. It limits marsh transgression. So marshes can move to some extent with sea level rise, and marshes obviously help buffer wave impacts from storms and mitigate stormwater. It's really a talk for another day. Filling in flood zones is allowed. I'm a huge proponent of, maybe 1 to 3 feet of geotechnically stabilized fill on lower sites to try to prevent some nuisance flooding. That's a tool in the toolbox. But the real ideal is to try to create a sort of living shoreline, something that is potentially vegetated that can move with sea level rise. So, sort of a floodable park with maybe a vegetated slope, again, is sort of the ideal there. The bottom right, this is a CRMC product. This is Tidal marsh vulnerability analysis. So it sort of shows what marsh transgression would look like unabated in this area. And that's with water table and sea level rise increase. So you can see a lot of the downtown Wellington Ave, Spencer Park area would become marsh potentially if we didn't do anything about it. So here's the reality of the situation. These are the CRMC storm tools, SDE, suggested design elevation maps. These are based on more accurate wave modeling, and obviously they take into account sea level rise. CRMC's rolled out something called a coastal hazard analysis worksheet, which requires people to analyze their building heights over the design life of the structure. For Aquidneck Island, it's not the whole island, but there's a lot of problem areas, sort of north to south. We have Common Fence, Island Park, sort of the coasters, Connell Highway area to the north of Easton's Pond, again, the Wellington Ave, Spencer Park area, downtown and the Point. And these colors, the yellow basically shows a storm surge height of 25 feet, a lighter sort of yellowish brown shows 20 feet. The land elevation in these areas can be as low as 3, maybe even 5 to 7. So you could actually picture 20 feet of water by 2100 on a storm. It's almost a bit surreal. And again, we just sort of have, zoom in on those 2 areas I mentioned. And I promised Mark and I didn't speak ahead of time, but there's no one size fits all solution for these things. This is really diverse and complex problem that really requires analysis, I would say almost at the neighborhood level. Climate change can obviously exacerbate inequality. Wealthier areas have funding and they can sort of resist longer than low-income areas, which are often the first that can be displaced. And big picture, sort of, some filling, some armoring is probably appropriate in some areas of downtown Newport, especially where there's a lot of historic and cultural resources. But other primarily residential areas, some retreat, potential reuse is probably advisable. Just kind of brief aside, some of the reason I'm here is back in 2019, I worked with the Builders Association, who worked with FEMA to revise the state building code definition of height to make it more consistent and also allow structures to be elevated up to 5 feet above the base flood elevation or the SDE 3-foot maps, provided it was used for freeboard. So if you were raising your house to put parking underneath on the appropriate foundation type, you could actually build your house taller than the code would allow. Unfortunately, since then, many municipalities have sort of gone backwards. And they have changed their zoning ordinance to redefine height to basically remove that allowance. So we've gone from the house on the left, which was low, over to the house on the right. And in a lot of communities, we've gone back to the house on the left. I'm trying to let people know that that issue exists, make people aware that it's actually happening. I understand there's a lot of different concerns for elevating structures. There's social, fabric of the neighborhood. There's aesthetic. There's views. But I'm of the opinion that these are often overshadowed by the potential flood risks. There's a couple different models out there, potentially special use criteria, zoning, or maybe even special flood boards that could review applications to ensure the process is reasonable. But again, ultimately, I think property owners, people living in the coastal zone really need to be aware that that's an issue exists so they can talk to their elected officials. I do think the current approach with the reversion of the zoning is a bit reactionary and has the potential to ignore the issue, which could potentially result in a glut of at-risk structures being built. And bottom right-hand corner, you're just going to see a little excerpt from UCLA Anderson review, and they're sort of asking if the $1 trillion coastal housing market is a future financial crisis, which certainly actually may be. just going to touch on this really briefly. It's just a quick case study, something I did in Staten Island. They actually bought out a handful, or actually 3 different neighborhoods, put no build easements on there. So a lot of those houses are actually actively being demolished, and what they're building, you can actually see a photo of in the bottom right-hand corner. So it's a seawall and levee project, but they're also adding in shoreline access, and again, a vegetated buffer here. It's an absolutely massive project. It's really only feasible in really dense urban core areas, but it does provide a really nice framework and ways to address stormwater, coastal access, retreat, buyouts, and changes to infrastructure. And I think Bob Rulli is going to talk about this a little bit more. Sort of second to last slide here. So just a couple of notes. So, obviously, if we can try to build a bit more intelligently and try to bake in those longer term flood maps into our building practices, that would be excellent. One of the things that municipal and elected officials can do is apply for low interest hazard mitigation assistance loans. So I actually have a fellow who works for me who did this. They had this program in New Jersey, and literally for years, all he would do is go to different houses, and they would engineer ways that they could raise those houses up and build appropriate foundations. I mean, they must have done them for thousands and thousands of homes. We really want to try to incentivize coastal retreat where it's appropriate, especially in repetitive loss areas where, a very small number of houses are responsible for a vast majority of the claims. But the biggest message is these are really long-term municipal-wide issues, and we really should be undertaking financial analysis to sort of understand all the risks, whether life safety, ecosystem services, insurance, infrastructure, et cetera, and try to make determinations on either incentivizing or buying out coastal properties where it's fiscally prudent. 2 other issues I'll talk about really briefly. I don't really have a ton of time, but the 50% loophole, this sort of regulates how much money can be put into non-conforming structures each year. And the problem with that loophole is that it ceases after a year. So you could add 50% one year and then 50% the next, and so on and so forth. And there's some other loopholes with FEMA in terms of filling properties, where once they're filled, FEMA loses all the regulatory power, and they can go and build silly things like basements in places that are realistically in flood zones. And the last message is, not something we can do, but something, again, we can push our elected officials to, is to try to remove the subsidy for FEMA. Really, the system needs to pay for itself, and I think higher insurance rates would obviously yield more resilient building practices. And let's see the last slide. So this is a picture you can actually find on Wikipedia. This is Island Park in Portsmouth right after the 38 hurricane. There were homes on the right, there were homes on the left, and they were all washed out. You can even see telephone poles were sort of knocked over. So it's really a good reminder of what's out there. Yeah, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Questions or comment, certainly let me know.
Thank you, Neal. Before Bob speaks, I want to just explain to our folks on the meeting what storm tools are, because a lot of people don't really know what storm tools is. It is an interactive database that was created by CRMC, which was somewhat revolutionary and very progressive across the country. I think we were the first place in the country to design such a user database where users of the database can go and really learn about their specific property. They've enhanced the program so that you can overlay a variety of conditions to explore. Say you wanted to look at your house in a 100-year storm with 2 feet of sea rise. There are also some keys there for municipalities to get an understanding of what the loss of property may mean, with specific requests, with specific notices to taxes. I mean, these houses are heavily taxed in these beautiful shore areas, and if they are gone, it's going to mean tremendous impact to municipal budgets. So I think Terry was going to put storm tools, the link to storm tools, in the chat box. We talked about it a little earlier, and it takes a little bit of work to understand storm tools, but if you're very interested in really learning about the impact of sea rise on Rhode Island, then I suggest you fool around with storm tools. you'll be amazed at what you see. I know Terry, in fact, I think it was after we met to really get the full briefing on storm tools that Terry and I decided to form this caucus because we were overwhelmed by what we saw. So anyway, thank you very much, Neal. And then Bob is next. I really wanted Bob to come onto this call because I saw the September 16th meeting of the Warren, Rhode Island Planning Board and a presentation that they've made with respects to some of the planning that the town of Warren is doing. And I was really impressed with it. And I hope that everybody on the meeting will be as impressed with it as I was. This is a community that's really taking this very seriously. And I think they have a lot to teach other towns. So Bob, it's all yours.
I am going to try to get my presentation up. So good evening. I'm Bob Rulli. I am the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town of Warren. My interest in this is twofold. In my professional relationship with the town of Warren, but until June of this year, I was a resident of Aquidneck Island. My wife and I were, and I understand the importance of having a conversation about this. So right now, the town of Warren had received a grant from the Southeast New England program through EPA to do what we call a SNEP grant, looking at a two-segment program. One was looking at the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge and flooding in the Market Street area. And then if you've been through Warren, if you've been on Metacom Avenue and you've been on the 136 corridor, you would say, oh my God, this really needs to be redeveloped. So we're looking at upzoning that area and the potential for increased workforce housing opportunities and for people that might be displaced through flooding that they could stay in this community. So as we've gone through this analysis, I mean, we've heard conversations about storm tools. I mean, these are all the methodology and data that we've used. We've used property tax and tax data from the town, GIS data, climate forecast through NOAA, just echoing what Neal had said. We don't rely a lot on FEMA documentation and programming. We look at NOAA to be more reliable. Storm tools is a really important tool for us to use. We've looked at FEMA and flood factor as disaster impact analysis, and then working with information from RIDOT and statewide planning and national data with respect to impacts to roads. So we are in the early stages of a very comprehensive look at what could happen in the future. And as we got into this process, NOAA and FEMA look at 50, 100-year, 500-year scenarios. I didn't want to look at those scenarios. I wanted to look at something that was much more current because I think people lose sight of, what the realities this could be. So what you'll see tonight is we looked at what are the impacts in 2035, what are the impacts in 2050. We did go out to 2070 and 2100, but I mean, for most people that are here today, 2035 and 2050 have real impacts. So as part of this process, we are at the concept level. We're just initially looking at what impacts are financially as well as what property loss could be. Why are we doing this? Because we are at our average elevation in Warren is 7 feet above sea level. We know that climate change is happening. We know that we're having stronger storms. We know we're having more intense precipitation events. For a number of years, the town has worked with URI and the Coastal Resources Institute there in partnership with the town of Barrington. We are updating our hazard mitigation and flood mitigation planning. And we've worked with UPenn through a grant with the Van Buren Charitable Foundation to have a studio project. So that is all formulated where we've gone with this project. The Market to Metacom is a two-piece project, but tonight I'm just going to focus on the Market Street piece because that is, I think, more relevant to this conversation in terms of what the impact of sea level rise and flooding are. So the Market Street project, I mean, and I'll start this, by saying also that, Warren is the smallest town in the smallest county in the smallest state. Now, Central Falls is smaller than Warren, but that's a city. But we are the smallest town in the state. But in this area, it's about 84 acres. We have 400 buildings, 700 housing units, and 30 businesses. So this is what this area looked like in 1877. This is not much different than what the Back Bay looked like, where, the Back Bay, just by definition, is an area that was going to be prone to flooding. So as you can see, most of the dwelling units or businesses were away from the waterfront. Through the industrial expansion at the end of the 18th century, 19th century, we had 3 major mills that were in Warren. Centrally located to that would be creating housing. And much of that infill housing was in these areas close to the water. Fast forward to 1939, you see some of this housing being filled in. So this was this area. This is a snapshot of Market Street, Belcher's Cove. This was taken a week ago on Friday on a king tide. The bottom left is a National Grid substation. You can see how close the water is to flooding that substation. This is without any kind of storm conditions. This is at 10:30 in the morning on a placid day, but you can see that we have homes in this area that might believe they have an infinity pool in their backyard, but they don't. Because if we added storm surge and wave action, these homes are going to be flooded. So in this area now, so we looked at the land use, we look at what the use of properties are, we look at how much of it is utility, municipality, and this is a story that we have to tell people because as I said before, FEMA and NOAA look at 50 and 100-year scenarios. We're looking at much more current scenarios because we think it's important that people realize that this is going to happen in a shorter time period than most people want to believe. So for our elected officials, we want them to understand that we have $138 million of assessed value. We have 586 parcels that are being taxed. The average parcel value is $236,000. Revenue to the town is $2.41 million. FEMA flood zones, it is all in a flood zone. As Neal talked about, we are all this is all in an AE 13, which means that we have to be 13 feet above the floodplain plus 1. We're not. So as we've gone through these, we've done 3 public presentations to the public. We'll do one more, but again, we wanted to look at what scenarios look like going forward. So in 2035, 2050, 2070, 2100, it exponentially gets worse. We think it's important that people have, when we talk about tornadoes, we talk about hurricanes, we talk about wildfires, people can see that instantaneously on the news. When we talk about sea level rise, it's difficult for people to imagine what 6 feet or 6 inches of sea level rise will look like. So what we took was, an illustration of one of our critical areas and said, this is what 6 inches of sea level rise looks like in 2035. This is what 3 feet of sea level rise looks like in 2050. And again, we go to other areas and 2070, we're 6 feet above. And it starts to reinforce for people the problem that this is not just imaginary, this is a real problem. Looking at other streets, same thing. As you're telling the story, it's important that people understand what the story is. This was just from a rain event on Child Street, which is 2 streets removed from Market Street, and a storm on September 1st. We had 7 inches of rain in 2 hours. We had 1 house condemned. We had 1 family that had to be evacuated. This is the impact of sea level rise. So what happened is this was all fresh water, but it couldn't get into the stormwater drainage system because it was overwhelmed. So as we're telling the story, we're looking at, okay, what does sea level rise projection look like for a 100-year storm? What does sea level rise look like with storm surge and wave action? Things that we also look at is transportation assets. So in the Market Street, Child Street area, those are both evacuation routes for the town. Our ability to get to people to a shelter would be completely cut off in certain storm situations because our shelters are to the eastern part of the town and we would be overwhelmed by flooding. Flood insurance maps, you know, as Neal talked about, completely unreliable, and we need to reinvest our investment in terms of looking at that. But you know, if you see this area, this whole area is in a flood zone. I'm going to share the same slide that Neal had showed. As we're talking to people in the community, you know, we think they need to understand all the criteria that goes into how flood insurance is looked at. And Neal touched on this too. So last Friday, I believe, FEMA came out with their new flood projections. There's been a number of studies that have been reduced in the last couple of weeks that every community that has any susceptibility to flood and sea level rise really need to rethink how they are planning. So what we're trying to do with this plan is if we do nothing, what are the impacts? And if we become aggressive and look to the future, what could we do? So if we do nothing, sea level rise will grow by a foot by 2035, 3 feet by 2050, 6 feet by 2070. We're going to see an increase of flooding events, either from hurricanes, nor'easters, or seasonal precipitation. When we look at, you know, again, we're trying to tell a story to our constituents. Here's what these things look like. Here's what normal sea level rise looks like. The picture on the left is what sea level rise looks like with storm surge. So, and again, I was never comfortable with, we should just look at 50 and 100-year scenarios. So, you know, I wanted to look at what happens in 2035. So I was fortunate enough to have a grad student, Patrick McCann from URI last year, do some mapping for us. He did over 100 maps. So in 2035, if we did nothing, we'd have 58 properties flooded, buildings flooded would be 31, housing units lost 57, residents displaced 86. The loss of tax revenue isn't significant. The building loss cost is, it's 8.1 million, but this doesn't take into consideration what repetitive loss is. And repetitive loss is going to impact insurers and lenders, whether they want to lend money on properties like this. And I think it's important that the community understands that these are, you know, what we're looking at in the short term. That's 14 years from now. When we go to 2050, we see more properties flooded, buildings flooded, housing units lost, residents displaced. The building loss cost now jumps to $16.6 million. That's incredibly significant for a small community.
Is that 16 million in today's dollars or in the dollars of that time?
In today's dollars. That's
Well,
in
so it would
today's
be more
dollars.
than that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when we go out to, you know, if you had a 100-year storm event, which, you know, could happen. We've had several of those. I mean, our 100-year storms are becoming like 5-year storms or 10-year storms. We're looking at $9 million in flood impact, loss of business revenue. So our whole purpose of this is to tell a story, not to scare people, but these are realities. And I'm very fortunate that I have a town council and I have a town manager that supports us sharing this information with our residents. Go out to 2050, that number jumps to $12 million. So what we've done is try to project out in 4 phases, what it looked like in 14 years, what it looked in 2050, 2070, and out to 2100. And the impacts of this to a municipality are catastrophic. that a municipality could not recover from this if you do nothing. Available programs are, yes, there are flood insurance programs available. Like Social Security, whether or not this is going to survive, we don't know. And what we've found is that the missing component from the table is the lending industry and the insurance industry. Concerns for the town are, and this is raised previously. So what if we have property owners that just abandon their properties? We know that 40% of the property owners in the area, that Market Street area, are from either out of town or out of state, which tells us these are investment properties. Would they walk from these properties? So the town has the obligation to remediate them. We have oil tanks, we have paint cans, whatever is left in these basements, we have to deal with these. We have the environmental pollution. J Mills Park, which is adjacent to Belcher's Cove, is capped landfill. We have, I think, 12 DM registered sites in this area, and doing nothing is really not an option. This is my poster child for bad situations. This is on Market Street at Redmond and Belcher's Cove. So in this picture, what you all can see is that this is an auto body shop. This is a furniture stripping business, and this is a dry cleaner. And this is on a king tide. This is not a storm event. This is on a king tide. So we know, based on NOAA's projections, that this area is going to be flooded every day by 2035. We don't have the option to do nothing. We need to do something.
Not to mention those chemicals that are in those buildings.
Absolutely, absolutely. So roadway impacts, we're very fortunate because of what we've been doing with this. We've entered into a pilot agreement with the Rhode Island Department of Transportation to do a road adaptation pilot program. There are no road adaptation projects in New England or in the Northeast to deal with road adaptation for flooding and sea level rise. There are one couple in Florida down in the Keys, some in Louisiana, some out in the Midwest for the Mississippi River and the Iowa area, but we're not thinking about these things and we're not planning for these things. And we think we need to plan for these things. So we are very excited. I mean, I've had lots of criticisms about our participation with DOT. Their ability to step up and use some federal money that they had left over to do this road adaptation strategy is incredible. And that will be a playbook for other communities. Because again, if we look at our impacts from sea level rise, we have 2 emergency evacuation routes that will be underwater. And it grows as the sea level rise scenarios go forward. So what we're looking at is phase relocation and restoration. We know that we need to do property buyouts, and we know that we have to reduce the amount of impervious surface area. Looking at first phase, if we bought out 58 properties, that would cost us about $14.9 million. We think combination of federal funding through FEMA, the Army Corps, USDA, and as part of our second part of this project, the redevelopment of the Metacom corridor, where we can use tax increment financing, we can put town money into this as well, that we're coming to the table with skin in the game. We look at 2100, we could be up to $139 million at what it costs us for property buyouts. We don't think we need to do that, because we think in phase 1 and phase 2, if we can work with DOT and come up with, because our evacuation routes are state roads, by the way, it's 136 and 103, that if we could, use 103 to be somewhat of a barrier or a dike, similar to what's been done in Europe, then we don't get to phase 3 and 4. that we can solve some of these problems, but it's engaging the state and all the stakeholders and having this conversation. And if we looked at what phased relocation would look like, so this area that we're showing here, and basically, if I go back to this, the bird's eye view from the 1800s, we're back to the same scenario. I mean, we filled in this area, and it was never meant to be filled in. So this area could now become a buffer that doesn't require us to do phase 3 and 4. As I said, we're working with DOT. We're very fortunate to have that partnership. I mean, unprecedented in the state that we have this cooperation, and I'm excited to see where this takes us. Just again, identifying different types of funding for phased relocation. Our hope is that we can reach agreement with property owners for buyouts. If we can't, the next phase of what we're looking at is working with the law school at Roger Williams to say, okay, how can we come up with a legal strategy for safe and health and safety to like buy people out at a fair price. Our website for what we're doing at the market to Weticom is here. We've got all of our public presentations are on this site. There's an abundance of information available on this site. Again, as I said, Patrick from URI helped us with mapping. We did over 100 maps looking at different scenarios in terms of who owns the property, where do they live, what's the age of the property, how many of these properties have basements. And this information is critical to any community that is looking at this problem. But again, I just have to stress that I am so fortunate that my town council and my town manager has encouraged us to kind of take this deep dive in and look at these types of situations. So with that, I will end my presentation and I thank you.
I thank you, Bob. It's really amazing work you guys have done. I'm completely impressed with it a lot. Terry, you want to take it from
Yes.
there? I mean, I don't know what you think about, all three presentations were really terrific.
Yeah, I learned a lot. I was trying to grab that website for Warren to throw it into the chat. I'm not sure if I got the right one or not. I think I'm on the town website. Is that where you start, Bob?
Yeah, I can send it out to you and
Okay, and we'll share it.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, this was really informative. I think there's some things for you and I to talk about, Lauren.
Yes, there are.
Up at the State House, a couple of different things with the road adaptation, and I'm glad to hear that RIDOT is working with you.
Me too. Me too.
Thank you so much, all
Yeah,
three of
really.
you. Now, we had a few questions, if people are willing to stay on for a couple.
Another 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Yeah, I agree.
We did have some questions submitted in advance, and I'll just throw them out. And if any of you want to take a stab at answering them. The first one comes from Arnold Robinson, who's from Barrington. I didn't see if he's with us or not tonight, but he says, for what future period of time, especially in the context of predicted sea level rise, do you believe communities should be planning and making physical adaptations such as retreat and or raising structures? And you kind of spoke about this, Bob.
Bob's got that
Sooner
one
than
tied up.
100 years.
Right, right. Let's look at 15.
Right.
Well, I have to preface my remarks by saying that Arnold is somebody that has worked with us on our plan. But I know that Arnold is invested in Aquidneck Island. He's from Portsmouth originally, and he's working on projects with the city of Newport. But tomorrow is important. I mean, it's 15 years out to 2035 is realistic, but these things are happening now, and we're seeing the frequency of storms more and more debilitating to communities. Whether it's in Kings Park down, I lived off of Wellington for many years. When I lived on Aquidneck Island, I saw what the impacts of that are. We don't have the luxury of pausing. We need to be aggressive in like dealing with tomorrow.
Even just the rain events. I live right off of Fairview, and I'm sure you all saw the footage of what happened to Fairview when a catchment basin exploded and just totally ripped up the road like something you just out of the movies or something. It was really like, oh my goodness, this is what we're talking about. Yes. So that was our first question.
I would just say quickly, Terry, too, to the point made earlier, that I also think, there's been so much discussion about 100 years. This is what it's going to be in 100 years. Made earlier, it's so easy for people under that scenario to say, that's 100 years. And I think it's important that people realize, as Bob just said, that if we get a 100-year storm, one of the really sad things about the conferences that we've learned is, I know there's a question as well asked about, well, why aren't people taking this more seriously or something to that effect? Well, at several of the conferences, people have said people began taking this seriously in their jurisdiction when they had a 100-year storm.
Correct.
And that was the thing that really woke people up, like, hey, this can happen here. And I just hope and pray that in Newport that doesn't have to be the thing that really gets us moving.
Well, let me comment on that also. I think after Ida went through last month, there was certainly a surge in calls that I got about what are we doing? And there's a lot of flooding, and it wasn't quite the storm you're describing, but there were people in Newport that got like 6 feet of water in their basement, and they were, really devastated. So I think we've had a little wake up call with that storm last month.
One of the questions, I don't know which one of us could answer it tonight, but what does the law allow Newport homeowners to force the city to do to address flooding problems that they know and avoid addressing?
That's a really good question.
And as Neal pointed out, Newport's not the only community that walked back some of the more forward-looking zoning changes, right? I'm not sure if that's something, Lauren, and you and I need to talk about with people back at the state level, or if we just need to implore our local town councils to rethink that.
Yeah, I've said this often, Terry, you've heard me. The front line of flooding is municipality and property owners. They are the front lines.
For sure.
And at the state level, there's only some things that we could do. I mean, I have a few things in the hopper for next year myself that I'm going to hope I can get the attention of the legislature about. But, the property owners and the municipalities really need the support here to do kinds of things that Bob has described that Warren's looking at. I mean, that's why I'm so excited.
I could just comment from a municipal standpoint. I mean, the state promulgated that 5 foot of freeboard is allowable. So for local communities to say that it's not, or a historic district to say that they want to ignore that, that's not a satisfactory answer. I mean, that is the state law.
And we passed a bill on that about 5 years ago, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's, that's not up for debate. And, and I think unfortunately, local boards kind of get lost in that, but that is the law. I mean, in a flood zone, in a flood area, you get the 5 feet of freeboard. I mean, you've had properties that were developed, commercial properties on Thames Street and America's Cup that have taken advantage of that. I mean, so we've done that in Warren with the tourist redevelopment and 99 Water Street. So you park cars at that first level. You raise the utilities out of the flood zone, and you don't have any residential units in the flood zone. That's what it is. It does give you, if your building height requirement is 35, it allows you to go to 40.
I remember when we passed that law.
Right. So I think people just need to be aware that that is the state law, and maybe some pushback to local boards. Is that, Neil, do you have a comment there?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Right, and I think a lot of that was sort of promulgated by, planning boards, and, there wasn't explicit information given to homeowners and flood zones, when a lot of those changed. And I think that's really where it starts, is just really making people aware that change happened, because, I just happened to be at a planning board meeting. I didn't even have, any foresight that it was coming. That's how I got notified. So I really think with, these GIS systems, I think this is something you can pick out in a municipality and really just inform these owners and, let them debate it, I think. But I think the information is step one, is just absolutely making them aware that those issues exist.
Well, I also think it's a matter of having people on planning and zoning boards that really grasp this issue and really working with our communities to ensure that those boards are informed, they understand the impact of the decisions that they're making. They are trained on climate and sea rise. There was actually something I created, to tell you the truth, and it was a bill that required training for them on sea rise and climate, and the second series has just come out. So I hope that would at least get some consistency across our planning and zoning boards. So it's actually just for planning boards, so that they would see the kind of stuff that Bob shared with us when they come on to the board. That way, when they make decisions, they are more informed. And I know that they're hardworking volunteers, and I commend them for their community service. But this is a complicated issue. We've just seen a lot of stuff tonight that's pretty complicated, and people need to have this information before they make decisions.
And are there any, if there's any questions from the audience? I think we've more or less covered the things. There was one question from a gentleman named Ford Ames.
Who's on?
And maybe Ford would like to unmute himself and ask his question directly, because I'm sorry, but you went above my abilities.
What was the question again?
I think it was you that put in retreat, raise, or defend. Seawater provides hydrogen for fuel cells. Oxygen can help to revigorate ocean dead zones at large scale. This form of ocean water sequestration contributes to hydrophase fall and level management. I don't know if something got cut off, but that's what I had.
No, hydrophase is sea level.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so did we address your question this evening?
That was above our pay grade a little bit.
Yes.
No, it's a solution scenario instead of a defensive thing.
Yeah.
And it's all about large scale, instead of hydrocarbon combustion, getting into using water as a fuel, and sequestering these rising seas with a hydrogen economy, a true blue, what I call a true blue hydrogen economy. And so by turning water into gases, we lower sea levels, just as obviously it's totally pie in the sky, but inch by inch, or a micromillimeter by, the smallest units. If we start doing this, I think is a positive thing. Totally clean, you can drink your exhaust,
Oh, I see. Okay.
And this whole fuel cell battery debate now, it still leaves out direct climate things related to water and water use. And I just think it's almost like a gift, actually, this extra water that's melted, that we can actually use it in all our industrial processes in a hydrogen economy. And then the oxygen, basically using, in my case, marine hydrokinetics to pump down oxygen on the off cycles and revigorate dead zones.
I just want to comment that I put a few links in the chat box just now, and they're links to the Coastal Resource Management Center, where you can find storm tools. They're links to Resilient Roadie, which was passed in 2014, which was really the launching of a resiliency project statewide. It created what's called the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council for the state of Rhode Island, which has the responsibility of implementing the Act on Climate and really working with state departments to see that we lower our emissions and do all the things that we need to do in order to try to do our share here in tampering back on this climate crisis. So those 3 links are in the chat box, and they're user-friendly, they're designed by the state, and I think they will be helpful for folks that want to see what the state is actually doing right now. That's what they really tell you
Right.
at the state level.
In the CRMC too approached me about putting in a bill that we did pass last year, which was enabling legislation more to provide an educational opportunity for towns, for municipalities to begin using their hazard adaptation formula
Locally.
for construction for new development. And
Right.
we passed that. I think municipalities could have used it anyway, but CRMC is planning to do an educational tour through the 21 coastal communities, is what they were
Good.
telling me that their objective was, to get more of the municipalities to be thinking in that way when they're dealing with construction projects.
Well, I think maybe we could wrap it up. Gentlemen.
Terry and
great.
Lauren, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. And can you read it, Michael?
Yeah, I don't see it.
Yeah, it's from Liz. Sorry. Yeah, Liz Tabor.
Hi, Liz.
How can new homeowners and real estate agents truly know the risks they're facing when FEMA produces maps showing inaccurate flood zones?
That's a very good question.
I stopped practicing real estate because I was selling so many waterfront properties that I feared that in a few years, the owners would find out they now have to pay for flood insurance they can't afford because they weren't accurately informed. And I don't understand how our political leadership thinks that's helpful to homeowners.
Well, I think to answer your question, I would certainly be willing to work with the Realtors Association to figure out a way to do one of several things. Maybe add some information to the audit that you fill out before you put your house on the market, so that you can discuss these kinds of issues. I don't know what, I know Liz, we're friends. I know she's a forward thinker. I don't know to what extent all of her colleagues want to take this step, but Liz, if the Realtors Association wants to meet with Terry and I, we'll do it.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what it comes down to, really creating policy around that. I mean,
I might just say, hi, Liz. For the moment, consult a design professional. Sometimes that's the only way to get it right. There's really just a lot of information out there. I mean, if you reach out to your local engineers, architects, surveyors, I think they can give you, some good I think it's very forward thinking, and my gosh, I really wish all realtors thought that way. I think for now in this landscape, that's really the best thing to do. And I mean, sure, long-term, maybe you can create a bit of a, educational initiative that, could walk you through it. I also think, using the coastal hazard worksheet, I think is a good tool that it's user friendly. It forces people to think about their timelines, right? Whether that's 10 years, 30 years, 50 years. And it's an easy way to walk through the storm tools mapping steps to kind of see what the impacts are going to be over that lifetime. So that might be a part B to that answer is, run your clients through the coastal hazard worksheet. I think that would give you some good results.
yeah, I think you're right. I think that's probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add to that the storm tools it's a wonderful tool, but there's been pushback from realtors across the state to use Siri as a tool to inform people that this is the risk that you're about to incur. And that's a self-serving thing for realtors. And I mean, these tools are available. I have people call me all the time in my position and say, my realtor told me this. I'm like, well, your realtor didn't tell you anything. And I'm not going to say this is a bad deal or a good deal, but this is what you should look at.
And I also think that you made a comment, Bob, about the insurance companies and the banks that are either insuring these properties or mortgaging these properties. When that starts to really crack down, it's going to become.
Well, I mean, I think that's something that, FM Global is based here in Rhode Island. They're the #1 reinsurer of flood insurance in the world. And that somehow, even with Sean O'Rourke's office, we have not been able to engage them in an active conversation
Neither have
about
I.
what are we
Neither
doing?
have I.
I mean, and
Neither
this
have
is,
I.
that's very frustrating.
I tried a couple years ago.
That's
Um,
frustrating.
Stephanie Schmidt has her hand raised, and I know she was one of the submitters.
Yeah, I think
She
we'll make
wanted-
this our last question. 'cause
Yes,
it's going
and
on
I
now.
don't think I got to the last part of your question, Stephanie, but you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, first of all, I want to say I only wish that we could have Bob from Warren in Newport. We need a carbon copy of you. And I do have
tried.
a simple question that tracks to that, and that is our mayor, our city manager, or any members of our city council in this meeting tonight?
No.
Thank you.
I
I'm
think
not-
one of your, actually, Angela McCullough did sign
Oh,
up.
Angela, I
so-
did speak to Angela about joining us. She was going to join us, so I don't see her here.
But we
And
can
I should
make
tell
sure
you, I am
she-
working with Angela on some flooding issues,
And we'll
so,
make sure she gets a copy of this, a recording.
yeah. I spoke to Angela just, I think, yesterday. She did say she signed up, so I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you for this
Thank you.
really spirited and informative conversation. Terry, I'll turn it to
Yes,
you.
likewise. I'm grateful to all three of you gentlemen for coming in and sharing your expertise with us. And I've learned a lot. I hope the attendees that are on tonight have learned a lot. And reach out to us with any questions. We'll put a recording of this on YouTube and we can share it back out to the people that signed up that couldn't make it tonight. And thank you all for coming. And
Yeah, it'll
thank
be
you,
on my
gentlemen.
website too. Give us about a week, but I'll put it on my website. There's a place there for videos, so you can share it there if you like. So everybody have a wonderful evening. Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Very much.
Thanks for having us.
Care.
You're